Hello, Darklings. Today I want to talk about one of my most recent reads and review Bishop by Candace Nola. Now, for me, this is my first time reading Candace Nola, and so, I don't really have any frame of reference for comparison or anything like that. So I'm just going to strictly talk about Bishop and my thoughts on this work. And I do want to say that I think that there was, it was very clear early on that there was a lot of potential here. And a lot of that potential is realized in this novella. It's an intriguing setup. You've got, a main character whose name is Troy Spencer, and his sister and niece have gone missing in the Alaska wilderness, and he is determined to move heaven and earth to find them. He will do anything to get them back safe and sound. And, right off, that's kind of really refreshing, because in this day and age, there's a lot of people with family members who didn't drive 3 blocks out of their way to help them out. So, it made him immediately likable. We were invested in his story. We're invested in seeing him get the positive outcome that he desires. And, that really engages you with the character straight off. There are also some other, the foundation is laid for some other developments and other revelations with other characters early on. Nothing feels like a blindside. That doesn't mean that the book is predictable, but what it does mean is that the author did her job of establishing the hints and, just sprinkling in the information that leads us to some of those later revelations. And so that makes it extra satisfying, because, nobody really likes to be, to feel like the author just pulled something out of thin air. It's the author's job to make sure that they've woven in the details that make revelations later in the novel pay off. And Candace Nola definitely does that in Bishop. So in addition to, touching on the importance of family, this is a book that also has a tremendous sense of place. You definitely feel that environment, that wilderness, and the cold, and and what it would be like to be lost in that environment. There's an excellent pace to this novella as well. It just moves at a brisk speed, so there's no dawdling on things, which is is great, because you never feel like you lose the main thread. At the same time, the characters are developed. There's more than one character with a story going on here, and she manages to juggle all of those things very effectively. It also builds that mounting sense of dread throughout, and so there's definitely that anticipation of the outcome that keeps you turning the pages. So those are all great pluses. Lots of great things about Bishop for people to enjoy. At the same time, I must admit that I have a few niggles, and so I'm going to talk about some of those niggles, and it's just food for thought for you. Some of it doesn't affect my rating of the book overall in the slightest, and other things are a little bit harder for me to dismiss out of hand. So let's just jump on into those things and take it or leave it. So, niggle number 1 is a technical issue. And this is a really minor one in the grand scheme of things. Pretty much any book that you pick up anymore, even from one of the big New York publishers, is going to have some typos in it, or some technical errors. And, I think most of us have come to expect a handful of them and don't really pay that much attention. But one thing stood out in this particular work, and that I just want to mention, and that is the use of apostrophes. There is a character whose name is Daniels. Daniels with an S, not Daniel. And we have, in some places, when it's used in possessive, we have Daniels with it ending S apostrophe, which is correct. And in other places, we have it presented as Daniel apostrophe S, which is incorrect, unless you've introduced a new character whose name is Daniel, not Daniels, but it's evident from the text that it's the same character being referenced. And, you know, this isn't one of those things that's going to affect my star rating on a book or anything like that. I'm just going to give a word of advice to whoever wants to pick this up. If you're unsure after Googling 10 million times, which, believe me, you have no idea how many times I Google things when I'm writing to double check the rules. If you're unsure, you're still unclear, pick one and go with it. Go 100%. Be totally correct or be completely wrong. Here's why. Because even if you're completely wrong, a lot of people won't actually notice if you're consistent. But if you change how you present things or how you use a rule regarding mechanics or grammar, you can guarantee that people will notice, and then they'll be aware that you have made a mistake. So my advice is just pick one and go with it, even if it's wrong. It's okay. It's not the end of the world, but people will be less likely to notice. And people like me won't say anything in a review. I mean, not that it's a really big deal. I really do want to stress that. It's just, you know, it's one of those things that when you're evaluating a book, it is something you look at. If it was excessive, it would definitely affect my star rating. This is not the case in this book. So take that for what it's worth. All right. So niggle number 2 is a little bit trickier for me to address and for me to process as a reader. This goes over to my understanding of the Wendigo. And my understanding is that Wendigo territory encompasses like what would be northern Minnesota, the Great Lakes region, central Canada, and the Great Plains in the U.S. Now, the Wendigo is specifically tied to Algonquin nations. And this matters because Indigenous nations in North America are distinct from each other. And while there are some similarities between different nations, they are all individual, and they all have their own customs and beliefs and mythology that goes with that. And it's really important because that we pay attention to the distinctions, because that's part of preserving the heritage of Indigenous persons in North America. I mean, look, you know, anybody who knows me knows this is a bit of a bugbear issue for me because, you know, I find it very important that we be respectful to Indigenous nations and their cultural heritage. And I'm also very concerned about how much Indigenous nations' cultures are appropriated. And so, you know, to me, it matters because it has to do with accurate representation. Now, I did do some more research on this when I was preparing this review, and I didn't find anything that extended the Wendigo into Alaska. I could be wrong, I could be missing something, and my sincere apologies if I am. However, it did really trouble me that it did not appear as though this was an appropriate mythological being for the setting. And you can get into, well, maybe it moved, whatever. I mean, here's the thing. There are some fantastic mythological beings that are connected to Indigenous mythology from Indigenous nations that are in Alaska. And I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, and I'm very, very sorry for that, but you've got the Gootikal, the Aralatak. You could have had a 10-foot Sasquatch. You could have had the Qualupillik. I mean, there's a lot of different options, and I do wish that we had seen something that related to the setting in an appropriate and respectful sense. I mean, you know, again, this is one of those things where some people are going to roll their eyes at me and ask why I care. Well, you know, to me, it's on par with saying that, that the cultural heritage of people in China is the same as the cultural heritage of the people in Indonesia. It's not. And, you can't possibly tell me that it wasn't possible to have done a Wendigo story if you really, really, really had to do one, without staying in northern Minnesota or in central Ontario, in Canada, or, in the areas where the Wendigo actually was from. And the reason I'm saying that is because geographically, everything that you needed is in those areas. I've been to northern Minnesota and many of the places mentioned here. I grew up in Ontario. So, I'm just saying, it was possible to have maintained that locale, if you were really adamant on doing a Wendigo story. It was also possible to use a different being if it was essential for the book to be in Alaska. And that, that's one of those things that a lot of readers aren't going to notice. This is something that I have researched extensively, and, I read a lot of works by Indigenous authors, and so perhaps I'm more finely tuned to this than some other people are. It's just one of those things that for me matters. And I did go to the authors, to their Twitter page. I went to their Goodreads page. I went to their Amazon page. I was reading their bio. I looked for any indication that they themselves were Indigenous. I did not find one. More importantly, I did not find any Indigenous nation that claimed them, which is actually very critical when you're establishing Indigenous identity. And so I, again, apologize sincerely if I am incorrect, but to the best of my knowledge, this author isn't Indigenous. And, bottom line, when you're writing about another culture's mythology, you run the risk of appropriating their mythology. And it's really, if you're going to do it, it's really important that you be respectful, that you put in the time and effort to do the research. And I just personally feel that by transporting the Wendigo from the region where it's located and putting in Alaska, I really feel like it's a form of appropriation that I personally don't think is appropriate. And I'd really, really, really like to see authors who aren't Algonquin stop writing about the Wendigo. Personally, that's my opinion. We're all very creative beings. We can make something up. We do not have to appropriate from another culture. That's my 2 cents on that. All right, so the next point that I want to talk about is about point of view. And unfortunately, many writers don't actually understand the difference between omniscient point of view and head hopping. Omniscient actually is a point of view from an external character, as it were. For example, God. We often equate the omniscient perspective with God or a godlike being. Now, omniscient lets readers have access to multiple characters' perspectives, but sometimes people think that they're writing omniscient and they're actually head hopping. All right, let's get into this and break this down a little bit more. First, I'm going to give you some background with some quotes. Amber Royer explains this as the omniscient narrator is a persona who happens to know what is going on with your characters, while head hopping happens in limited third person when the author is trying to put us in the head of or have us vicariously be multiple people in the same scene. The problem is that every time we drop into a different character's thoughts, we have to reorient ourselves, which kills your forward momentum. For omniscient to work, the narrator has to be seen as a separate character or an impersonal force reporting on events. This narrator must know what is going on with every character and can tell us how each one feels about an event, but can never drop us down and be that character. All right, so now let's go over to Jamie Gold, who illustrates the difference between omniscient point of view and head hopping in an article called What Makes Omniscient Point of View Different from Head Hopping. Go and Google that, look that up, read those examples. They will explain in a crystal clear fashion what the distinction is between these presentations in writing, and make it really clear. I also want to quote Ellen Brock, who explains, omniscient means all-knowing. It does not mean jumping into the heads of different people. In many cases, omniscient narrators seem godlike, but head hopping does not evoke the godlike, all-knowing feel of the omniscient narrator. It reads like we're simply jumping between the brains of ordinary characters. In other words, in head hopping, there is no sense that there is one consistent voice behind the camera directing the novel and pulling the reader through the story. So, why does this matter? Why am I bringing this up in this review? In the climax of Bishop, there's a little bit of head hopping. And in one case, it's just a couple of lines. It's jarring, particularly because the point of view actually is pretty consistent throughout the book up until that point. You know, when you head hop, you risk confusing the reader, you risk losing the reader, and making it harder for them to keep track of what character knew or did what. Choosing point of view is about choosing the most effective perspective, the best lens for each scene for maximum emotional impact. But when readers are confused and you're jumping around, you reduce that emotional impact. And so that's part of the reason why point of view is really important. I'm a big believer in consistent point of view. It's a bugbear issue with me. Look, the exception proves the rule. There are some people who break the point of view rule and head hop and are able to do it effectively. It requires finesse and extreme skill. You need to really make sure that the reader is anchored as they move from one character to the next, so that they're very clear on whose perspective they're getting at that point in time. And in this particular case, with the head hopping that did happen in the climax, I just don't feel like it added anything to the scene, and it detracted. So, you know, I felt like it was something that was worth mentioning. Again, on its own, in this particular instance, because it is pretty minor in the work overall, it wouldn't be enough to affect my star rating. It comes into play in terms of considering the other little niggles that I have with the book, but not in a significant way. However, for any of you out there who are aspiring authors, who are wondering about point of view, wondering about things that some of us who are published authors and editors and who have been professional reviewers notice when we're reading, this is something that jumps out at me, and as my husband, it is the kind of thing that will set me off and make me abandon a book. So not that significant overall in this book, but it was present, and I don't feel like it served its purpose in this particular case. All right, friends, we're on to my last little niggle that I'm going to talk about with Bishop. And to start off, I want to read you a quote from Bishop from early on in the book. Daniel's broad shoulders filled down his thick coat, and his long black hair was held back in a neat ponytail. A strong Native American heritage was clear in his features: chiseled jawline, deep-set, almost black eyes, high cheekbones. Now, that's all that I need to read to address the issue, and you can already probably see where this is going. I mean, look, setting aside the Native American thing, because there are some Indigenous persons who opt to use that terminology simply because it's one less battle to fight. And in the scale of things, it's not as offensive as the other word that still gets used a lot that should not ever be used by anybody who isn't Indigenous. Anyway, having said that, it still isn't the preferred language. The most appropriate terminology is Indigenous or Native. And I understand that terminology changes over time. For example, I myself, when I was researching for books that I wrote back in the aughts, I mean, in Canada, Aboriginal was being used by a lot of government websites. And that is not the preferred terminology today, certainly. And, you can get into a lot of debates about whether it's appropriate or not. If I could go back and change those books now, I would certainly take that word out. So that's just a little side note. Technically speaking, it isn't the most ideal language. Having said all that, the real issue there centers around that reference at the end, after the deep set almost black eyes, high cheekbones. Now, in this particular context, the high cheekbones are specifically being connected to the person's presumed ancestry and used as a verification that they portray features that the person associates with Indigenous persons. Now, here's the problem with this. I mean, you can hop on over to Twitter and you can do a search and you can find out real quick just how ridiculous Indigenous persons think it was that Elizabeth Warren tried to claim Indigenous heritage based off of high cheekbones. Whew, yeah, it's a stereotype. And I actually want to read a tweet about this, and I'm not going to identify the tweeter, in part because Indigenous persons receive a lot of harassment on social media. This person wasn't specifically commenting about this book. I'm reading this to substantiate what it is that I'm saying, because this is a person who has Indigenous heritage, who has identified their nation, who has other people who I know are Indigenous who speak for them. And that is all really important when it comes to verifying Indigenous identity. This is the tweet. Reflecting on the fairly recent Native Twitter discourse that was happening about high cheekbones, stereotypes, and the origins of how it comes from when Native people were starved. And wow, I'm feeling away. I mean, let's just stop and unpack that for a second. The high cheekbone stereotype goes back to when colonizers were starving Indigenous people. That's part of the origin behind it. It isn't, first of all, accurate. There are many races of people who have high cheekbones. And so it certainly isn't on its own an indicator of Indigenous heritage. But having said that, when there is this connection back to, when your ancestors were starving, that's really, really a really negative connotation to bring up. And it is a stereotype. Perpetuating stereotypes is harmful and dangerous. And it's something that we all need to be more aware of. And we need to work more at weeding it out. And I really wanted to do my homework on this as well before I said something about it. And part of the reason I'm saying something about it is because I've been specifically told by Indigenous persons that it is very wearying for them to always have to be the ones to fight the battles. And that when people who are allies notice something is incorrect, that we should be the ones to speak up. And I wanted to make sure I had my facts in order. I wanted to make sure that this was done respectfully and correctly. I mean, look, this is stuff that, perhaps a lot of people don't know. But if you're going to start including Indigenous characters in your books, and you're going to be using Indigenous mythology in your book, then at least watch The Canary Effect. At least do some research. At least talk to some Indigenous people and run some of this terminology by them. And run it by more than one, because no one person speaks universally for all Indigenous peoples. And getting different perspectives helps you understand whether or not what you're presenting is accurate or inaccurate. I say this again because, look, I could do a whole separate video on the things that I would change if I could go back and change my books that Dorchester published in the aughts. But I can't. But what I can do is talk about what I've learned since then. And, and I think that it's incumbent upon us to make sure that we've done our homework. I really thought that I had talked to some Indigenous persons. However, what I really should have done before including an Indigenous character in my book was I should have talked to people who still live on their nation's land or on reserves. And I didn't do that. I talked to somebody who was Indigenous who worked for the RCMP, for example. Well, obviously they didn't have a problem with the RCMP. Anyways, this is a tangent. I don't want to run down that road and derail this review. But the point is that getting multiple perspectives will help you. And when in doubt, err with the most respectful approach possible. When in doubt, leave it out. I don't know everything that there is to know, but if you really don't have Indigenous friends and you're struggling, then, DM me, email me. All of that information is online. So I'm just going to put a pin in that there. But I am going to talk a little bit about this a little bit more, just to say that Indigenous identity is really important. It's really important to be sensitive to in how you approach representing Indigenous persons and also in verifying Indigenous identity. And I say that because it seems like every day of the week there's a new pretendian who's being, uncovered and revealed. And what ends up happening is that there are white people who presume that they have Indigenous heritage, and they present themselves as Indigenous, and then they apply for and take grants and opportunities that were specifically set aside for Indigenous persons. And in so many cases, like Michelle Latimer being one example, it's later established that they do not have the heritage claims that they alleged, and that they, whatever their situation was, they didn't qualify for the opportunities that they took. And they took those opportunities away from other Indigenous persons. And so to me, this is just all part of a great big, issue around respecting Indigenous identity and also really ensuring that it's reflected correctly when we are writing with Indigenous characters in our books. And, I realize that a lot of people are probably completely unaware of what I'm talking about and have no idea that there is a Native Twitter, that they have no idea that there are thriving Native communities on all social media sites, and they have no idea that pretendians are a thing, and they're like, what are you talking about? But this is a huge issue for Indigenous persons in North America. I can't speak to other locations around the globe. I just know that it is a huge issue here. And in talking about that, I want to draw your attention to this great article. It's called How I Came to Understand I Am Not Cherokee by Barbara Presnell. And listen to these quotes. This is just fascinating. She talks about first that she'd heard all of her life about how her grandmother was Cherokee and who her grandmother was descended from. And people would say to her, quote, "You've got your grandmother's high cheekbones," end quote. And, so, she started looking into this. And based off of what her grandmother alleged about her heritage, if it was true, her grandmother would have been 1/132nd Cherokee. I don't even know how to say that as a fraction. 1/132nd. It's that is such a minuscule amount. That isn't even like your pinky toe of Cherokee. Anyways, but her grandmother still applied for membership in the Eastern Band of the Cherokee Indians. Pardon me for using that word, it's the technical name. And her grandmother was denied. In spite of this, there was still a process for her to understand that this was not her heritage. And here's a quote from the article. A lot of people, including well-known politicians and celebrities, claim to have a Cherokee ancestor on some far-reaching branch of the family tree. In fact, according to National Congress of American Indians scholar Vine Deloria, Americans from Maine to Washington have claimed Cherokee ancestry. And the article quotes Deloria as saying, more often than not, that ancestor was an Indian princess, despite the fact that the tribe never had a social system with anything resembling an inherited title like princess. End quote. And here's another quote from the article. To be Cherokee means to be raised in the culture and community of the Cherokee people, to have learned the traditions, to have suffered the injustices and the prejudices. Not my grandmother, not my father, and not I or my siblings were raised Cherokee. We were children from a small town neighborhood, children of a mill worker and a teacher. Cherokee to us meant that place in the mountains where our maternal grandparents took us to buy tomahawks and fake headdresses. In other words, it's really, really, really important that you live your identity if you're Indigenous. And yes, there are people reconnecting. I'm not going to get into that. I'm just saying that we really need to be careful about our representation and about accuracy, and we need to do the best that we possibly can. In this particular case, the high cheekbone things was all over the place in media, in mainstream news, just a couple of years ago when Elizabeth Warren was, running to be the Democratic nominee for president. And so I feel like this is something that more people should be aware of, and that it should have gotten on a lot more people's radar. But having said that, a Google search turns it up instantly. And if you head to Twitter and you type in, high cheekbones native, you're going to get tons of responses from actual Indigenous people mocking this. So this is something that it was a lot harder for me to overlook in the book. It's only mentioned once. It's really unfortunate it was near the beginning, because it is the kind of thing that makes me put a book down and walk away from it. And I came really close because I was just like, oh, is this going to be a book where I'm going to constantly feel like my stomach is twisting because there's inaccurate representation and it's making me uncomfortable? Fortunately, that doesn't really persist throughout. I mean, other than the Wendigo issues, and I kind of wrapped those in a ball and set them aside at the beginning and just decided to enjoy the story for what it was. However, I also felt that it was important to mention in a review because it does affect my overall ranking of the book. And, unfortunately, it's the combination of the Indigenous issues with a few technical mistakes like the point of view and the apostrophes that brings my star rating for this book down to a 3-star review instead of the 4-star review that the book could have had. And the bulk of that lost star all comes from the Indigenous issues. I just feel that this is an area where, at the very least, the research should have been done to avoid a significant mistake like using a stereotype that actually is harmful for Indigenous persons. And that's my opinion. Other people are going to think I'm overreacting. Other people are not going to care. Personally speaking, I think that we, have been learning in recent years that we need to do better. and that we need to really be respectful of the cultures that we're writing about. And even in recording this video, I've used various terminologies, and I've struggled with some of the terminology and hesitated because I want to be as accurate and respectful as possible. And what I would say at the end of this is that if I have said anything that is incorrect, if an Indigenous person sees this and they feel that I've used incorrect terminology or that I have been inaccurate in my understanding about the Wendigo, about high cheekbones, about any of the things that I've said about Indigenous culture and heritage, then I most certainly welcome you to reach out to me and let me know. I am more than willing to listen and learn, and I believe that that is our responsibility, to make sure that we are respectful human beings and that we honor other cultures instead of appropriating them. So, those things, kind of fell by the wayside for me. I pick up on those things much more so than I necessarily would from other cultures. So, for example, I might review another book that deals with things from different Asian cultures and not pick up on the appropriation. That doesn't make it okay in those situations. It just means that, a review is always filtered through the lens of the reviewer, and to a certain extent it is limited by their knowledge or the scope of knowledge that they're able to acquire when they're doing research for the review. So that's just something to bear in mind. Obviously, because I have a lot of Indigenous friends and because I have read a lot of works by Indigenous authors and because I researched some of these issues extensively myself, I'm going to have more to say about them. So, again, your mileage may vary. Just remember, though, that at the beginning that I did talk about a lot of positive things about Bishop. It has a really great pace. It has a really great sense of place. And it manages to develop plot lines for multiple characters and do so effectively and keep you invested and interested. And those are the real biggies. I mean, I could read this book and I can understand that Candace Nola has tremendous potential. And I do look forward to seeing what Candace brings to us in the future.